She was born in a small village where kindness was often mistaken for weakness, and her gentle ways became both her gift and her downfall. From the time she was a child, she carried a softness in her heart that made her attentive to the needs of others. She was the one who would pause her chores to help an elderly woman carry firewood, or sit with crying children until their fears melted into laughter. Even animals seemed drawn to her. Stray dogs followed her home, and birds perched close whenever she sat quietly by the well. Her presence had a calming effect on those who were willing to look beyond themselves, yet not everyone welcomed her goodness. In a place where suspicion and envy festered easily, her light made others feel small, and jealousy grew like a creeping vine. As she blossomed into a young woman, her beauty seemed to glow from within. It wasn't merely in her features, though they were delicate and striking, but in the way her kindness illuminated her presence. People whispered about her in the market, some admiring, others bitter, for they compared her quiet dignity to their own restless ambition. Those who thrived on cruelty and control resented her ability to inspire loyalty and affection without effort. They could not understand how she, with nothing but her soft voice and generous heart, could command respect without demanding it. And so, slowly, resentment hardened into something darker. It began with whispers. A jealous stepkin muttered that no girl could be so pure without harboring secrets. Another villager, hardened by greed, claimed that she bewitched people, that her eyes carried hidden spells. These words spread like smoke in the wind, curling into the ears of those eager to believe them. Fear mixed with envy, and the girl who had once been seen as a blessing was soon recast as a danger in their stories. Children who once followed her to hear her songs were told to stay away, and families who once welcomed her presence began to close their doors. Her stepmother, who had always despised her for the love she received, found fertile ground in this growing suspicion. She spoke with venom disguised as concern, saying that the girl's beauty was unnatural, that she would bring misfortune if she remained unbridled. The more she smiled sweetly in public, the more bitter her schemes became in private. Every kindness the girl showed, every moment she shone brighter, only deepened the hatred of those around her. The village, already ripe with unease, was ready to accept the lie if it meant they could smother the light that reflected their own shadows. One evening, when the moon was swollen and pale, they gathered together in secret. A group of them, her stepmother, jealous rivals and fearful villagers, decided that she must be silenced. Death seemed too final, too dangerous. What if the stories of her innocence proved true? Instead, they turned to a different cruelty, a punishment that would remove her from life's joys without granting her the mercy of passing on. They sought out an old charm, a curse whispered of in fearful tones, said to trap a soul between life and death. The stepmother claimed to know the words, having bartered with shadows long before. The girl, unaware of what was plotted, went about her life with her usual grace. She tended to the fire, helped children with their lessons, and hummed quiet tunes that carried through the dusk. She sensed the cold stares that followed her, but she did not allow bitterness to take root in her heart. Her trust in the goodness of others blinded her to the storm that gathered against her. That trust would become the very weapon used to bind her. They lured her into the square under the guise of a village ritual, telling her it was meant to honor her mother's memory. With innocent belief, she walked among them, her eyes wide and trusting. As the night deepened, they circled her, chanting words that stung like unseen daggers. She tried to speak, confusion in her tone, but her voice faltered as a strange heaviness spread through her body. Her limbs grew weak, her breath shallow and her eyelids heavy, though she fought to keep them open. She looked around, seeing no kindness in their faces, only satisfaction cloaked in false concern. Her knees gave way, and she collapsed gently to the ground as though being laid down by unseen hands. She tried to whisper, tried to plead, but no sound came. Her stepmother approached, pressing a hand to the girl's brow with mock tenderness, sealing the final words of the curse. In that moment, the girl's breath slowed, her chest rose and fell as if in slumber, but her spirit was trapped in a prison woven of malice. They called it mercy, though it was nothing but cruelty dressed in ritual. They told themselves she would sleep forever, never waking to trouble them again. They placed her on a bed of woven reeds, closed her eyes as though she were peacefully dreaming, and left her in a quiet room to be forgotten. Yet her face was serene, untouched by the spite that had condemned her, and in her stillness there remained a strange power. The village believed the curse had ended her story, but they had only written its beginning. In her eternal slumber she dreamed, and in those dreams, something vast and unrelenting stirred. Her body lay in the quietest corner of the hut, unmoving and pale as though the very essence of her had been pulled away. She looked like carved marble, too still, too delicate, as though she belonged not to the living but to the statues the elders sometimes shaped from clay. Yet when the villagers pressed close, their curiosity outweighing their fear, they saw her chest rise, slow, shallow but steady, like the faint rhythm of an echo that refused to fade. Whispers spread quickly, murmurs carried from one lip to another, until the entire village believed she had slipped away into death, her soul carried far beyond their reach. Some said the curse had not only stolen her breath but her spirit as well. But those who lingered, watching with more care than the rest, swore she lingered in the strange space between life and death, tethered by something unseen. Her silence was unnerving. The girl who had once sung as she fetched water, whose laughter had rung like bells during the harvest, now lay without a word, her lips pressed shut as though the curse had sewn them closed. Mothers pulled their children away from the hut, warning them not to stare too long, for it was dangerous to gaze upon someone who lived in neither world. The men muttered about spirits and the anger of unseen forces, while the women covered their heads and prayed, fearful that her stillness was an omen. Yet the hut where she lay became both feared and revered, a place no one dared enter unless compelled. At night, they said her silence grew heavier, pressing against the walls, seeping into the soil beneath the hut. Dogs howled and refused to go near. Some swore that when the moonlight touched her skin, her eyelids trembled, as though she fought unseen battles in a place none could follow. The fireflies that drifted near her window lingered unnaturally, glowing brighter, as though pulled into her strange breath, as though her very stillness had a gravity that drew the living and the ethereal alike. Those who had cursed her avoided speaking her name aloud, but guilt etched itself across their faces. Their fear was different from the others, it was sharper, heavier because they knew what they had done. To them, her unmoving body was not just a victim of some distant spell but a mirror of their cruelty. Still, they comforted themselves with the idea that she was gone, that their curse had triumphed. But deep down, unease gnawed at them. If she truly were gone, why did the earth beneath her hut feel restless? Why did her chest continue to rise and fall, a stubborn reminder of life's refusal to vanish? Days blurred into nights, and still she remained in that fragile state. The villagers began to grow used to the sight of her, though never entirely comfortable. They spoke of her as though she were a ghost already, yet they carried offerings to her hut, leaving food, flowers, or trinkets at the doorway. Some said it was pity, others said it was an attempt to ward off the wrath of whatever force kept her lingering. But in truth, none dared neglect her presence, because the silence around her grew louder with every passing day. It was the kind of silence that made hearts pound faster, the kind that stretched into dreams and unsettled even the strongest among them. Children whispered stories that she could hear them even as she slept, that her spirit drifted through the village while her body lay still. Old men told one another that her breathing was the mark of a tether, a cord holding her back until her vengeance was ready. The curse, they feared, had not bound her completely, it had only locked her in a state of waiting. The longer she lay, the more restless the air around her became, as if her presence rippled through unseen layers of the world. The villagers could not name what they felt, only that when they passed by her hut, they walked faster, their steps heavy with unease. Some swore they heard faint sounds from within, not words, not cries, but sighs that belonged to someone dreaming too deeply. Others swore the shadows inside her hut shifted in ways they should not, as though her body was no longer alone. And though the cursed girl remained unmoving, her slow breath proved she lingered, patient and enduring, caught between life and death, waiting for something no one could yet imagine. In the depth of her cursed slumber, the first dream began to form. It was not the kind of dream born of longing or peace, but one spun from memory, sorrow, and the sharp edges of betrayal. In that dream, she saw the faces of those who had mocked her kindness, the ones who had whispered curses behind her back and then spoken them aloud with venom. Their laughter still echoed in her mind, but in the dream, it bent and twisted into something hollow, something desperate. She stood before them in the dreamscape, her eyes glowing with the sorrow that had been forced upon her, and they shrank back from her presence as though the mere weight of her silence crushed them. But this was no ordinary dream, no vision locked inside her mind alone. The curse that had bound her body also bound her sleep to the waking world. Her first dream began to slip through the walls of her hut, spilling into the night air like a mist that crawled over rooftops and seeped into windows. The villagers who had played a part in her suffering stirred uneasily in their beds, tossing, muttering, their faces tightening as if they felt something pressing on their chests. They dreamed of her, though they had not wished it, though they had tried to forget her face. In their nightmares, they saw her standing at the edge of the village, her hair drifting like smoke, her eyes unblinking. She said nothing, but her silence was louder than any accusation. When they tried to speak, their voices failed them, and when they tried to run, the earth beneath their feet turned soft, pulling them down as though the soil itself remembered what they had done. They woke drenched in sweat, gasping for air, their hearts pounding against their ribs. But even when their eyes opened, they swore they still felt her presence lingering, watching, waiting. The first dream spread from one guilty heart to another, binding them in a web of fear they could not escape. Each night, it returned with greater clarity, shaping itself from fragments of memory and sorrow into a presence that felt real, almost tangible. By the third night, those who had mocked her refused to sleep. They gathered around fires, trying to ward off the visions with chants, with offerings, with desperate prayers. But even then their eyes grew heavy, and when they blinked too long, they saw her standing just beyond the firelight, her gaze cutting through the flames. The villagers who had been innocent of cruelty also began to feel the dream's edges, though it touched them differently. For them it was not terror but warning. They dreamed of her walking alone by the river, her tears falling into the water and stirring waves that spread outward. They woke with an ache in their hearts, feeling the weight of sorrow they had ignored. Some wept quietly in their huts, whispering apologies to the night, though they knew she could not hear. Or perhaps they feared she could. The first dream marked the beginning of her vengeance, though she never spoke a word. She did not need to. The dream was her voice, carrying the truth of her pain into the hearts of those who had silenced her. And as the village shuddered beneath sleepless nights, they began to understand that her cursed slumber was not a prison but a doorway. Through it she could reach them, remind them, haunt them. And this was only the beginning. It began quietly, almost like the hum of the night wind through the trees. At first, the villagers thought it was nothing more than their minds playing tricks on them after restless nights filled with haunting dreams. But soon the whispers grew sharper, clearer, impossible to dismiss. When they lay in their beds, the voices crept into their ears, soft but piercing, whispers that carried their own secrets, their cruelties, their laughter at her pain. Some swore they heard their own voices mocking her, repeating the very words they had spoken to wound her, now thrown back at them in the stillness of the night. The guilty ones could no longer find peace in silence. Whenever the wind blew through the village, it seemed to carry faint screams, as though someone unseen was trapped within it. The sound wrapped around huts and seeped into rooms, curling like smoke around sleeping children and waking parents alike. Mothers hushed their little ones when they cried, for even their children began to hear the whispers, though they could not understand their meaning. The older ones, however, knew exactly what the voices said, for they were reminders of the cruelty they had once enjoyed. Some villagers grew pale and withdrawn, muttering to themselves in the daylight as if trying to chase the voices away. They began avoiding the river, avoiding the hut where her silent body still lay, for they feared that being near her made the whispers louder. Others claimed they saw shadows flicker at the edges of their homes, shapes that had no source, shifting like figures walking in and out of the firelight. When asked, they swore they had seen her standing there, her lips unmoving while her voice filled the night around them. The whispers turned to accusations, repeating sins with eerie precision. A woman who had once mocked the girl's tears heard her own laughter echoing in the air until she screamed for it to stop. A man who had cursed her kindness found the sound of his own cruel words replaying in the rustle of the grass. The guilt they had buried began to claw its way out, their consciences no longer theirs to control. Some tried to block their ears, but the voices slipped through anyway as though the sound was not outside but inside their very bones. At night few dared to sleep. They lit fires, hoping the crackling would drown out the sounds, but even the flames seemed to whisper if one listened too closely. The brave ones gathered in groups, trying to laugh away their fear, but their laughter was quickly drowned by phantom cries carried by the wind. And when the wind grew stronger, they swore it screamed like a woman in pain. The innocent too felt the weight of the whispers, but for them it was different. They heard weeping, soft and sorrowful, as though the girl's heart still cried from beneath her cursed slumber. Some wept in return, kneeling in the dirt with tears of regret, whispering apologies to the night. A few even dared to go near her hut, leaving offerings of water, bread, or flowers, their voices trembling as they begged her for forgiveness. But none knew if she heard or if forgiveness was even possible anymore. The whispers did not stop. They followed the villagers everywhere, in the fields, in the marketplace, even by the river where the water now seemed to ripple with strange echoes. The boundary between waking and dreaming blurred, for the sounds felt alive, as if the girl's slumbering soul was weaving threads of fear into every corner of their lives. It was then the villagers realized the curse was far deeper than they had imagined. Her body might sleep, but her spirit had risen, reaching them in ways they could neither fight nor escape. Her dreams had begun to touch the living world, and now her voice, carried through whispers and wind, reminded them that their sins had not been forgotten. What terrified them most was not just the sound itself, but the question that hung heavy in every heart. If whispers were only the beginning, what would come next? Her dreams deepened like a storm brewing beneath a still surface. What began as whispers grew into something far more dangerous, something that reached beyond sound and into the very fabric of sleep. At first, the villagers thought it was exhaustion from restless nights that left them so weary, their eyes bloodshot, their minds unsteady. But then came the dreams. They were not ordinary visions of the night, fleeting and hazy. No, these dreams carried her face, her sorrow, her anger. The girl who lay unmoving in her cursed slumber now walked the corridors of their sleep, and there was no waking until she was finished. The first to fall victim was a man who had laughed the loudest when she was cursed, shouting that kindness was weakness, that tears were useless. That night, he dreamed of standing in a room filled with shadows. In the distance he saw her, lying motionless as if still asleep, but when he approached, her eyes opened. They were not the gentle eyes he remembered, but dark pools that swallowed the light. She sat up, and the ground beneath him shifted like sand, dragging him closer. He screamed, but no sound left his mouth. When she raised her hand, the shadows leapt from the walls, wrapping around him until he could no longer breathe. The next morning, his wife found him lifeless in bed, his face frozen in terror, his body stiff as though he had fought something unseen. The village shuddered at the news, but it did not end there. One by one, others who had played a part in her suffering began to dream of her. Each dream was different, tailored to the cruelty they had inflicted upon her in life. A woman who had slapped her for crying too loudly dreamed of standing before countless mirrors, each one showing her own hand striking the girl again and again until the reflection bled. She woke screaming but could not escape, for when she closed her eyes, the dream returned. By dawn, she was found pale and cold, her hands clenched into fists as if she had been fighting her own reflection. The villagers whispered in growing terror, for they realized her sleep was no longer passive. It was alive, a realm of vengeance where her spirit roamed free. She had become a hunter, and their dreams were her hunting ground. People tried to stay awake, but the body cannot resist sleep forever. Even those who fought hardest against slumber eventually drifted off, and when they did, she was waiting. Some begged for forgiveness, crying out in the night as if she could hear them. Others tried rituals, prayers, even breaking mirrors and burning herbs, desperate to ward off the power that clung to them. But nothing worked. Her curse was not bound by their fires or chants. It was born of pain, of injustice, of sorrow twisted into something far greater than they could comprehend. The more they resisted, the darker her dreams became. Those who had merely mocked her saw visions of her weeping in endless fields of ash, their laughter echoing until it turned to screams. Those who had plotted her downfall were hunted in their dreams by faceless shadows that whispered her name. And those who had spoken the curse aloud, sealing her eternal sleep, suffered the worst. They dreamed of drowning in her tears, rivers of sorrow filling their mouths and lungs until they awoke choking on air, if they awoke at all. The line between dream and waking began to blur for the entire village. Some survivors stumbled through the day muttering that she was following them, her figure appearing at the corners of their vision. Others claimed they felt her hand brush against their shoulder in daylight, only to spin around and see nothing there. Her presence had escaped the boundaries of slumber, bleeding into their lives like a sickness that could not be cured. And then the deaths multiplied. Entire families who had mocked her kindness never woke one morning, their faces twisted into masks of fear, their bodies cold. Children wept as they told others of the dreams they saw, the girl standing beside their beds, silent, her eyes glowing as she pointed toward their parents. The children lived, spared perhaps because they were innocent, but the adults who had joined in the cruelty were claimed one by one. The survivors understood now that there was no safety, no hiding, no pretending that her curse was a simple sleep. She had become a force that hunted them in the most vulnerable place, their own minds. Every villager feared the night, for sleep had become a battlefield, and in it she was always the victor. Those who remained trembled with a single question burning in their hearts. How long before her dreams found them too? The girl had been cursed to slumber forever, but it was the living who could not rest. And with each life she claimed in her dreams, her vengeance grew sharper, darker, more inevitable. For the hunted can run, but when the hunter waits in their sleep, there is nowhere to escape. Fear became the heartbeat of the village, thudding heavy in the chest of every man, woman, and child. No one walked with ease anymore, and no one laughed the way they once did. The air itself seemed thick with unease, as though the land carried her sorrow in its soil, pressing down on them with every step they took. Each night brought new terrors, and each morning brought whispers of another person who had not awakened. The once lively marketplace, filled with chatter and bargaining, had grown eerily quiet. People gathered in hushed clusters, their eyes darting nervously toward the cursed girl's home, where her silent body lay unmoving but her presence seemed to stretch far beyond. The villagers began speaking of her in trembling tones, never daring to say her name aloud. Instead, they called her the sleeper or the dreaming one, as though disguising her identity would lessen her power. Yet deep down they knew that their words were useless. Her spirit had already marked them, and no amount of evasion could protect them from what lurked in the darkness of their sleep. Rumors spread that her dreams were no longer confined to nightfall. Some swore they saw her reflection in water that rippled without wind, others whispered that her shadow appeared at the edge of fields even when the sun blazed overhead. Fear changed the way the village moved. Doors were barred before sunset, windows sealed with heavy cloths as if shutting out the night could keep her out. Families huddled together in silence, but silence offered no safety, for her dreams crept in regardless. Mothers held their children close, telling them stories not of hope but of warning. Do not mock, do not harm, do not laugh at another's sorrow, for the sleeper watches. Children cried softly into the night, unable to understand why their parents trembled, why strong men who once boasted of bravery now shook at the thought of closing their eyes. The elders were not spared either. Those who had joined the younger villagers in cursing her, thinking it a just punishment, found themselves tormented most of all. One elder, known for his stern voice and cruel judgments, was found at dawn with his eyes wide open, as if he had seen something unbearable in his final moments. His lips were cracked and bloody as though he had bitten them raw in his sleep. Another elder refused to lie down at all, pacing through the nights until exhaustion overcame him. When he finally collapsed, his body never stirred again. The people said her dreams had finally caught him, dragging him into the slumber he had avoided. The whispers grew more terrifying as the days went on. Survivors spoke of what they had seen in their nightmares. A woman admitted that she dreamed of lying in her bed, only to feel hands, cold, soft and familiar, wrap around her throat. She looked up and saw the cursed girl standing over her, eyes glowing, lips moving but no words escaping. Another man told of wandering endless fields of fog, where he heard her voice calling, mournful and steady. He ran, but the voice grew louder until it became a scream that tore through his bones. He woke drenched in sweat, his heart pounding so violently that he could not draw breath. He was dead by morning. Fear consumed the village in both waking and sleeping hours. People no longer trusted each other, for they knew that every hand that had raised against her, every mouth that had spoken cruel words, was now marked. Even those who had only laughed nervously in the background wondered if her spirit would count them among the guilty. At the well, women muttered prayers before drinking, fearing they might see her reflection in the water's surface. Men carried charms and talismans around their necks, convinced that a piece of metal or a carved figure could protect them from the wrath of a spirit whose power came not from the physical world but from dreams. The village healer was sought out by many, her hut crowded with desperate faces. She mixed herbs and brewed potions, promising to ward off nightmares, but even she did not believe in her remedies. When she herself failed to wake one morning, her death sent the village into greater despair. If the healer, who had always guided them through sickness and sorrow, could not withstand the cursed girl's dreams, then what chance did they have? The village began to rot from within. Fear turned neighbors into strangers. Those who once shared meals no longer visited each other's homes. Families began to speak in whispers even in daylight, convinced that her spirit might be listening. Children were hushed when they cried, their mothers covering their mouths in terror that the sound of weeping would draw her attention. At night, silence fell so heavy it seemed the village itself held its breath, waiting for the next dream to claim another life. Some villagers whispered of fleeing, abandoning their homes, their fields and everything they had built. But others argued that her curse would follow them wherever they went. "You cannot escape dreams," one man said with a trembling voice, and no one dared to argue. Sleep was a prison and the cursed girl was the jailer who held the key. By the time the moon grew full again, the village was no longer a place of community. It was a place of dread, where each person lived only in anticipation of the moment her dreams would come for them. They did not speak of if she would claim them, but when. And in every whisper, in every glance over the shoulder, in every shiver at the edge of sleep, the villagers carried the truth they could not escape. The girl they had cursed had become more powerful than the waking world, and now she hunted them from the shadows of their own minds. One by one, those who had cursed her realized that remaining in the village was unbearable. The air was thick with whispers, the nights filled with dread, and every dawn revealed another lifeless body. So, in their desperation, some chose to flee. They packed hurriedly, clutching what little they could carry, food, water, charms, and left without goodbyes. They believed that distance could sever the grip of her dreams, that the farther they traveled, the weaker her spirit's reach would become. But what they did not understand was that her power was no longer bound to place. It was not the soil of the village that held her curse, it was their guilt, and guilt followed wherever they went. The first to flee was a young man who had mocked her tears most often, delighting in making her sob for the amusement of others. He left in the dead of night, riding swiftly across plains and through forests until the village was far behind him. He reached a distant town where no one knew of the cursed girl, and there he convinced himself that he was safe. But on his first night of rest, the dreams came. He awoke to see her standing at the foot of his bed, silent, her closed eyes weeping tears that dripped like poison onto the floor. He tried to scream, but no sound came. In the morning, the townsfolk found him lifeless, his face frozen in terror. The rumors of his death spread quickly, though no one could explain how someone so young and healthy could die in his sleep. Another who fled was an older woman, one of the stepmother's allies, who had whispered poisonous words into the villagers' ears, urging them to curse the girl. She journeyed far, across rivers and mountains, until she reached a land where no one had ever heard the girl's name. She built a hut by herself, far from others, believing solitude would shield her. But solitude only magnified her fear. Each night, she lit candles and muttered prayers, begging protection from the unseen. Yet when her eyes closed, she found herself back in the cursed room where the girl had fallen asleep, surrounded by shadows. The girl walked toward her, expressionless, her lips parting in silence. The woman woke screaming, her heart hammering wildly, only to fall back into the same dream again and again until one night she never woke at all. Soon it became clear, escape was impossible. No matter how far the guilty traveled, her spirit hunted them in sleep. The curse did not tire, nor did it weaken. Sleep itself had become a death sentence, and the guilty were prisoners of their own exhaustion. They tried everything to fight it. Some refused to sleep, pacing their huts, drinking bitter herbs to keep themselves awake. They lasted for days, but eventually their bodies betrayed them. Sleep took them against their will, dragging them down into the girl's domain. Others tried to sleep in groups, believing that together they might protect one another. But each person's dream was their own, and no ally could save them once the cursed girl appeared in the shadows of their minds. The stepmother, the cruelest of all, was haunted worst. Wherever she went, her nights were filled with visions of her stepdaughter. She dreamed of the girl standing beside her bed, whispering words the stepmother could not understand, words that seemed to scrape the walls of her soul. She dreamed of hands, many hands, pressing her down into the earth, forcing her into the same eternal slumber she had wished upon the girl. And when she woke, her body trembled, her hair whitened, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. Yet even awake, she sometimes saw the girl's figure lingering in corners, reflected faintly in bowls of water, or in the shine of a blade. The curse had seeped into her waking life, making her madness as complete as her fear. Across the land, whispers spread of a group of villagers cursed by their own cruelty. Travelers told tales of people dying in their sleep, one by one, their faces twisted in terror. The story carried warnings. You may escape a village, but you cannot escape your own dreams. Those who heard it shuddered, wondering what kind of spirit could reach so far, breaking the natural laws of distance and time. The guilty dwindled, their numbers thinning until only a few remained. Each lived in terror, unable to rest, unable to find peace. They clung to the edges of wakefulness, their eyes wide with desperation. But eventually, sleep always claimed them, and with it came her vengeance. For the cursed girl was not bound to the earth, nor to walls, nor to distance. She was bound to the injustice done to her, and until every guilty soul paid the price, she would not release her grip. Thus, the reckoning of sleep became known far and wide. It was said that the girl's spirit did not need to chase her enemies across roads and rivers. They carried her with them wherever they went, because the guilt of cruelty is the heaviest burden, and in the quiet of slumber, no one could escape the weight of what they had done. The night fell heavier than any before, thick with a silence so unnatural that even the crickets refused to sing. The moon hung pale and watchful above the village, its light spilling across rooftops and dirt paths, but not a single door was closed, not a single lamp extinguished. Every house glowed with restless fire, every window revealed wide eyes glinting with fear. That night was different from all others, because not one soul dared to sleep. The surviving villagers had already seen too much. Too many had fallen victim in their dreams, their breaths stolen while they slept, their bodies left twisted in terror. And so, the people of the village decided together that no one would surrender to rest. They would fight against sleep with every ounce of strength, no matter how their bodies cried for relief. Mothers cradled their children and shook them whenever their eyelids drooped, whispering desperate words to keep them awake. Fathers marched in circles around their homes, muttering chants, drinking bitter herbs, biting their own tongues to stay alert. Even the elders, whose tired bones ached for rest, clung to the light of their lanterns as if flame itself could guard them from the cursed girl's reach. But the body is weak against exhaustion. As the hours dragged on, weariness crept into every corner like a predator, heavy and unrelenting. Eyes burned. Heads grew heavy. Limbs trembled. Some villagers slapped their own faces, others poured cold water over themselves, while a few staggered drunkenly through the square, shouting nonsense to drown out the pull of sleep. They all knew the truth. One slip, one blink too long and the cursed girl would come for them in their dreams. Madness took root quickly. A woman clawed at her own skin, convinced shadows were crawling over her arms. A man laughed hysterically in the middle of the street, his mind fraying as he repeated the same phrase again and again. If I don't sleep, she can't find me. If I don't sleep, she can't find me. Children whimpered softly, their innocence poisoned by the terror their parents could not hide. Even the animals sensed the madness, dogs howling through the night, goats thrashing in their pens as if trying to escape an unseen force pressing down on the land. The stepmother, more restless than all, sat in her hut staring into a cracked mirror. Her eyes were hollow, her lips dry. She had not slept for days, and yet she swore she saw her stepdaughter's reflection moving behind her, smiling faintly though her real body had long been locked in cursed slumber. She smashed the mirror with trembling hands, but when she turned to the water basin to wash her bloodied fingers, she saw the same face rippling back at her. She screamed, her voice joining the chorus of madness already consuming the village. As midnight passed, time itself seemed to stretch into something unbearable. Minutes dragged like hours and hours like days. People clutched one another in trembling silence, afraid that if they spoke too loudly, they might call her spirit nearer. Yet silence was no comfort, for it only made the whispers clearer. The faint sound of her voice carried on the wind, brushing their ears like cold breath. I am waiting, it murmured again and again, until even those who resisted the longest began to unravel. One man, delirious with exhaustion, collapsed in the square and closed his eyes for only a moment. The villagers rushed to shake him awake, but he was already gone, his body still, his mouth curved in a frozen scream. His death was a warning yet also a promise. None of them could hold out forever. By the final stretch of that endless night, the village was broken. Some wandered aimlessly, muttering to themselves. Others sat staring blankly into the fire, too afraid to even blink. The air was thick with smoke, sweat, and despair. They were no longer fighting only the curse. They were fighting themselves, their own humanity turning against them as sleep clawed at their minds. And above it all, the cursed girl lingered unseen, her spirit patient and merciless, waiting for the moment when every eye would close and every dream would once again belong to her. The night of reckoning did not come with thunder or fire, but with a silence that pressed upon every heart like a stone. 4 days the villagers had fought against sleep, tearing at their own bodies, whispering chants, swallowing bitter herbs. They had begged the gods to save them, had burned offerings until the skies choked with smoke. Yet no god came. And no matter how fiercely they fought, their bodies betrayed them. The cursed girl's spirit had waited patiently, circling them like a predator in the dark. She knew sleep was inevitable. Humans could resist hunger, thirst, even pain, but not sleep. Sleep was the breath of life, and when they finally surrendered to it, she would claim them all. The stepmother was the first to falter. Her eyes had been red for days, her lips cracked and bleeding, her hands trembling with every breath. She sat in her hut, clutching her head, whispering the girl's name over and over. She's waiting for me, she muttered, rocking like a broken reed in the wind. She's waiting in the shadows. She had tried to outlast the others, but her strength was gone. At last her head fell against the wall, her eyes fluttered shut, and she was gone. In her dream, the stepmother stood in a field of mirrors, each one reflecting her sins. She saw herself locking the girl away, beating her, mocking her tears. She tried to look away, but the mirrors surrounded her on all sides. From the glass, the cursed girl stepped forth, her face calm, her eyes endless. You caged me, she whispered, her voice both gentle and merciless. Now the cage is yours. The stepmother screamed as the mirrors closed in, their edges slicing into her flesh until her body was torn into countless pieces, each trapped forever within the glass. In the hut, her body stiffened and then lay still, her mouth frozen in an open wail. Her children, the girl's step-siblings, were next. The brother had mocked her cries. The sister had stolen her food, sneered when she begged for kindness. Now, when exhaustion dragged them into sleep, they found themselves wandering a forest that seemed alive. The trees whispered the cursed girl's name, their roots curling like snakes to ensnare their feet. The siblings ran, clutching each other, but the forest stretched endlessly. Then she appeared, stepping from the shadows, her hair flowing like dark water, her eyes glowing with quiet fury. "Did you laugh when I wept?" she asked the brother. The roots tightened around his ankles, dragging him beneath the soil until his screams were muffled by the earth. She turned to the sister. "Did you feast while I starved?" Branches coiled around the girl's arms, pulling her upward until the canopy swallowed her whole. When morning came, their bodies lay in their hut, their faces twisted with terror, their limbs stiff as though they had been bound even in death. One by one the others followed. The elders who had turned away from her suffering dreamed of fires consuming their huts, each flame carrying her laughter as their voices were drowned in smoke. The neighbors who had whispered cruel things dreamed of standing in the square, only to find themselves surrounded by shadows, their tongues silenced, their words stolen from them forever. The hunters who had mocked her hunger dreamed of endless pursuit, chasing prey that vanished just before they caught it, until they themselves collapsed, their hearts bursting in the chase. Each death was not random but crafted, shaped by the cruelty they had once inflicted upon her. Her dreams were not chaos, they were judgment tailored to each soul. And there was no waking from them. The stepmother's husband, her father by marriage, fought the longest. He had not raised his hand against her, but he had turned away, blind to her cries. When sleep claimed him, he found himself standing before the girl in silence. She did not strike him. She did not curse him. She simply looked at him until his shame grew heavier than chains. "You could have saved me," she whispered. And with those words, he crumbled into dust, as if the weight of his guilt consumed him from within. By dawn, the village was silent in truth, not the fearful silence of before but the silence of death. Hut after hut lay still, filled with lifeless bodies. Faces frozen in terror, hands clutching blankets, mouths half open as if they had tried to call for help. No one had escaped. Sleep had been their undoing, and her dream had been their grave. Only a few children, too young to know cruelty, stirred awake. They wandered the empty streets, crying for parents who would never rise again. They did not see the cursed girl, but some swore they felt her, a gentle breeze on their faces, a whisper that carried no malice. To them she had been nothing but a victim. And so she spared them. The village, once filled with laughter, gossip, and cruelty, stood broken and hollow. Smoke drifted from abandoned fires. Animals roamed free, their masters gone. The curse was complete. Yet, somewhere beyond the veil of waking, the cursed girl lingered. Her body was gone, her spirit forever bound to dreams. Those who had wronged her were gone, devoured by her vengeance. But her story would remain. Every whisper of wind through the trees, every flicker of shadow in a restless sleeper's eye, these were her echoes, reminders that cruelty does not vanish into silence. For the villagers who had cursed her, there would be no awakening. For them, there would only ever be the final sleep. They called it the night of endless sleep, though no one truly knew what to name it. The village had been full of life once, children's laughter, women grinding grain, men boasting of hunts, but in a single wave of darkness, it had become a graveyard. What remained was silence, broken only by the whispers of survivors from neighboring lands who stumbled upon the ruins. They found bodies lying where they had fallen, faces twisted in fear, huts filled with lifeless families, fires burned to ash without being tended. Only a few children survived, their young minds too untouched by malice to be claimed by the curse. From those children, and from wandering travelers who carried the tale beyond the ruined fields, the story of the cursed girl spread. It was told in hushed tones at first, as though speaking it too loudly might summon her spirit. They said she had been a kind child, one who harmed no one, but whose tears and innocence became the fuel for others' cruelty. She was mocked, starved, beaten, and finally cursed into a sleep meant to silence her forever. Yet the curse that was supposed to end her life had instead awakened a power greater than anyone imagined. For in that unnatural sleep, her soul had not been stilled, it had awakened into the world of dreams. And from there she found vengeance. The tale grew as it spread across villages and kingdoms. Elders told their people that her dreams had spilled into reality, seeping into the minds of those who wronged her. At first it was whispers in the night, guilt gnawing at their hearts. Then came the shadows that crawled through their sleep, until at last her enemies could not tell dream from waking. They saw her face in every reflection, heard her cries in every gust of wind. Some woke screaming. Others never woke at all. One by one, all who had hurt her fell, not by blade or poison, but by the soft weight of slumber. Her legend was not one of fire or thunder but of silence, of sleep. And that made it all the more terrifying. For no one, no matter how strong, how wealthy, or how guarded, could avoid the call of dreams. Even kings who built walls of stone and surrounded themselves with guards learned to fear her name, for guards could not keep away sleep, and no stone wall could bar the entry of dreams. Parents began to warn their children, never mock tears, never strike the innocent, and never curse the pure of heart. For her spirit lingers in the land of dreams, and she waits for those who wrong the helpless. Children who grew cruel were hushed quickly with the tale. "Do you want her to find you?" mothers whispered when little ones raised their hands in malice. "She watches from the shadows of your sleep. Be kind or she will come for you." Travelers passing through the ruined village swore the air still felt heavy there, as if the weight of her sorrow clung to the soil. Some said at night the huts whispered with voices of the dead, and if you dared to sleep there, you would dream of her eyes, eyes glowing softly in the dark, neither merciful nor cruel, only watchful. The story shifted as it traveled farther, embroidered with details like threads in a tapestry. Some claimed she appeared in white garments, glowing like a ghost. Others swore she wore the same rags she had died in, her hair wild, her feet bare, her face streaked with tears. A few said her spirit was no longer bound to her own tale, that she hunted not only those who had wronged her but anyone who dared to mock suffering. The wise spoke differently. They said she was no monster but a lesson, a warning carved into the memory of humankind, that every tear has weight, that every heart has limits, and that cruelty does not vanish simply because the victim is silent. The legend became a shield for the weak. Servants whispered her name when their masters grew cruel, knowing even the proud feared the curse. Wives told it to husbands when their words grew sharp. Villagers told it to each other when envy threatened to grow into malice. "Beware the dreaming curse," they reminded one another, "for dreams never die, and the innocent do not remain silent forever." Some say her spirit still roams the realm of dreams, neither at peace nor in torment, watching the world of the living through the cracks of sleep. On quiet nights, when a person dreams of being chased by shadows, they whisper it is her walking near. When a guilty heart wakes in a cold sweat, they say it is her tears dripping from above. Thus her story became not just a tale of vengeance, but a law older than kings and harsher than any decree. Never curse the innocent, for dreams themselves can rise as hunters of the living. And when they do, there is no escape, no blade to defend yourself, no distance to run, only the silence of eternal sleep.